Everyone talks about how narcissists make other people suffer, but almost no one talks about what happens when the narcissist themselves is quietly falling apart. What you are about to see will completely change how you read their behavior. There is something that happens inside the narcissistic personality structure when the external conditions that sustain it begin to shift, when attention becomes less consistent, when admiration becomes harder to extract, when the carefully constructed image of superiority starts encountering friction. It cannot simply smooth away from the outside. This internal deterioration rarely looks like suffering in any recognizable form. It doesn't produce visible grief or honest vulnerability or the ordinary human presentation of someone struggling with pain they cannot manage. It produces intensity, the first and most telling signal that a narcissist is suffering beneath the surface is not withdrawal, and it is not collapse. It is an escalating, almost frantic amplification of the very behavior that defined them at their most functional: the demand for validation. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's need for admiration was never a sign of confidence. It was always a compensation for the absence of it, a structural requirement of a personality that never developed the internal capacity to generate a stable sense of worth independently. And when that external supply becomes inconsistent, when circumstances reduce the flow of attention and affirmation the system depends on, the demand doesn't quietly adjust. It escalates. Pay attention to what this escalating demand actually looks like, because it is one of the most visible and yet most consistently misread behavioral signals in the entire narcissistic pattern. The fishing for compliments becomes more frequent and less subtle. The need to be acknowledged in conversations becomes more urgent. The sensitivity to being overlooked, underappreciated, or insufficiently praised sharpens to a degree that begins to feel disproportionate, even by the standards of the relationship. At first, it appears like insecurity surfacing temporarily. Most people interpret it as a rough patch, a period of unusual neediness that will pass once circumstances stabilize. But the hidden reason behind this behavior points towards something more structural. The escalation is not a temporary adjustment. It is the system signaling that the gap between what it requires and what it is currently receiving has widened beyond what the usual management strategies can bridge. This is where the manipulation begins to shift in quality, becoming less polished, less patient, and considerably more transparent. Because a narcissist operating from a position of internal stability can afford to be strategic about how they extract validation. They can wait, maneuver, create situations that produce admiration organically. But a narcissist who is suffering cannot afford to wait. The internal pressure is too immediate, too destabilizing, too urgent to allow for the kind of careful maneuvering that characterized their behavior when the system was better resourced. Then there is the rage, and this is the second signal. And in many ways, the most revealing one of all. What most people don't realize about narcissistic rage is that it is not, at its core, an anger response. It is a pain response. Specifically, it is the response of a personality structure that experiences any slight, any criticism, any failure to be treated as exceptional, as a direct and devastating assault on the fragile internal architecture that the entire persona was constructed to protect. Under ordinary circumstances, this response is managed, filtered through the social awareness that prevents the narcissist from displaying reactions so disproportionate that they reveal what is actually happening underneath. But when the narcissist is suffering, when the internal resources available for management and filtration have been depleted by sustained pressure, the rage surfaces with a rawness that is genuinely different from what most people have observed before. It erupts over incidents, so minor that witnesses are left visibly confused. A comment that would have passed without reaction on a different day produces an explosion. A small perceived slight triggers a response more consistent with a serious betrayal. And the disproportionality is itself the signal. Because what is being responded to is never really the incident itself. It is everything the incident represents in the context of an internal experience that was already at its threshold before the trigger arrived. Most people miss this warning sign because they focus on the behavior rather than the pattern beneath it. They address the specific incident. They apologize for the specific comment. They manage the specific moment, and in doing so, they never see what the moment was actually showing them. There is a behavior that emerges in narcissists who are quietly suffering that is almost impossible to detect unless you know precisely what you are looking for. Because it doesn't announce itself through obvious emotional display, and it doesn't appear in the interactions most people pay attention to. It operates in the background, in the quiet monitoring of other people's lives, in the way a suffering narcissist's attention becomes fixated, not on their own experience, but on the perceived success, happiness, and progress of everyone around them. This is the obsessive comparison behavior. And in a suffering narcissist, it reaches a frequency and intensity that reveals something the persona was always designed to conceal. What most people don't realize is that comparison was always present in the narcissistic personality structure, but during periods of relative stability, it was managed carefully enough to remain largely invisible. The narcissist could observe others' achievements and filter that observation through a superiority narrative that neutralized the threat. They were successful for now, but wouldn't last. They were talented in that area, but deficient in others. The comparison existed, but the internal management system was resourced enough to immediately counter it. When suffering enters, that management system weakens, and the comparisons that were once quickly neutralized begin to linger, accumulate, and intensify into something that looks, from the outside, like an unusual preoccupation with what other people are doing. Pay attention to the specific targets of this comparison, because they are not random. The narcissist in silent suffering doesn't compare themselves to strangers. They compare themselves to people within their immediate social or professional orbit. People whose success, relationships, or apparent contentment can be directly measured against their own current experience. Former partners who appear to be thriving, colleagues who receive recognition they feel they deserved, friends who seem to have built something stable, while the narcissist's own internal architecture is quietly deteriorating. The hidden reason behind this behavior is that comparison for the narcissist serves the same fundamental function as all their other behaviors. It is an attempt to locate themselves in a hierarchy that confirms their superiority. But in periods of genuine suffering, the comparisons consistently return results that the internal management system can no longer convincingly reframe. And the result is a deepening, quietly consuming sense of inadequacy that will never be directly acknowledged, but will shape virtually every behavior that follows. This is exactly what they want you to believe, that their sudden intense interest in what you are doing, where you are going, and how your life is developing is about you. It isn't. It is a measurement, and the urgency behind it reveals exactly how destabilized the internal experience has become. Then, running alongside this compulsive comparison, something else begins to emerge, something that seems, at first glance, almost like the opposite of the narcissist's usual behavioral signature. They begin to disappear. The sudden isolation pattern is one of the most misread signals in the entire spectrum of narcissistic suffering, because it contradicts so thoroughly what most people have come to expect from a personality type defined by its hunger for attention and social performance. The person who once dominated every room begins avoiding certain rooms entirely. The individual who engineered social situations to maximize their visibility begins declining invitations. The performer who required an audience begins, quietly and without clear explanation, removing themselves from the stage ATA first. It appears like maturity, like reflection, like a person finally developing the capacity to exist without constant external stimulation. And this interpretation, while entirely understandable, misses the actual mechanism driving the withdrawal. The narcissist is not retreating to reflect. They are retreating to protect. The persona, the carefully constructed, meticulously maintained presentation of superiority, confidence, and effortless capability, requires enormous internal resources to sustain. Under normal conditions, those resources are supplemented by the continuous supply of admiration, attention, and validation the narcissist extracts from social environments. But when internal suffering has depleted those resources, and when the supply from the environment has simultaneously become less reliable, the persona begins to show strain. And a strained persona, displayed in a social environment that has come to expect a particular performance, carries a specific risk that the narcissist psychology treats as intolerable: the risk of being seen as diminished, of the gap between the projected image and the actual internal state becoming visible to people whose perception of them the narcissist cannot control. Most people miss this warning sign because the withdrawal looks peaceful, because the absence of the usual drama seems like settling, because quiet, in a relationship that was rarely quiet, can feel like progress. It is not progress. It is concealment. The narcissist has not found stillness. They have found somewhere to hide until the performance becomes sustainable again. There is a shift that occurs in the narcissist's treatment of those around them during periods of deep internal suffering that is both predictable and deeply revealing, and yet, because it arrives gradually, rather than suddenly, most people fail to recognize it for what it is until the pattern has already become significantly more damaging than what came before. The devaluation accelerates. What most people don't realize is that devaluation was never simply cruelty for its own sake. It was always functional, a mechanism through which the narcissist's internal experience of inadequacy gets temporarily relieved by the act of diminishing someone else. When your own internal sense of worth is structurally dependent on being superior to those around you, making others feel smaller functions as a kind of psychological regulation. It stabilizes momentarily an internal state that has no other reliable method of achieving equilibrium. During periods of relative stability, this devaluation is typically managed, calibrated carefully enough to cause damage without becoming so visible that it disrupts the social environment the narcissist depends on for supply. A cutting comment framed as humor, a dismissal disguised as honest feedback, a comparison that diminishes without appearing intentional. The cruelty is present, but it is dressed well enough that many people around the narcissist spend considerable time doubting their own perception of it. But when suffering enters, when the internal pressure intensifies and the resources available for careful management are depleted, the calibration fails. The devaluation becomes more frequent, less disguised, and considerably more intense than what the social situation would typically permit. Comments that previously would have been filtered now surface unedited. Dismissals that once carried a veneer of reasonableness now arrive with a directness that leaves little room for the recipient to question what just happened. Pay attention to this shift in quality, because it is one of the most diagnostically significant behavioral changes in the entire suffering pattern. The narcissist who once devalued with precision is now devaluing with urgency. And urgency in this context reveals something important about the internal pressure driving the behavior. The relief that devaluation provides is becoming shorter-lived, requiring more frequent application of greater intensity to produce the same temporary stabilization. This is exactly what they want you to believe, that their increasing harshness reflects your increasing failures, that the escalating criticism is proportionate to something you are doing differently. Most people caught inside this dynamic absorb this framing entirely, spending considerable psychological energy trying to identify what changed in their behavior that produced this new intensity of criticism. Nothing changed in your behavior. Something changed in theirs. And the change is internal. Running alongside the devaluation acceleration is a signal that operates on an entirely different register, one that shows up not in what the narcissist says, but in how they physically and behaviorally present themselves to the world. The physical and behavioral deterioration begins quietly. Disruptions to previously rigid routines, a neglect of the appearance that was once maintained with careful attention, erratic decision, making in areas where the narcissist previously operated with visible confidence and control. These changes seem unrelated to each other, and they seem unrelated to anything happening in the relationship, which is precisely why most people fail to connect them to the broader pattern of suffering. The hidden reason behind this deterioration connects directly to the energy economics of the narcissistic personality structure. Maintaining the false self, the performance of superiority, capability, and effortless excellence is not a passive state. It requires continuous, significant expenditure of psychological resources that, during periods of internal stability, are supplemented by the supply extracted from the environment. When suffering depletes those resources and supply simultaneously diminishes, something has to give. And what gives is often the maintenance, the careful, energy-intensive upkeep of a persona that the internal system can no longer afford to sustain at its previous standard. Most people miss this warning sign because they evaluate each change in isolation. The disrupted routine seems like stress. The neglected appearance seems like a difficult period. The erratic decisions seem like temporary lapses in judgment. Seen together, as a pattern, they tell a different story entirely. The story of a system that is running out of the resources it needs to keep the performance going. There is a final behavioral signal that emerges when narcissistic suffering has reached its most acute stage, and it is perhaps the most paradoxical of everything observed throughout this entire pattern. Because what appears on the surface to be a display of power, dominance, and iron-fisted control is, when examined beneath the surface, something that points in the exact opposite direction. The phantom control attempts begin. What most people don't realize is that genuine control, the kind the narcissist exercised during periods of internal stability, was never particularly visible. It operated through subtle influence, through carefully engineered situations, through the kind of patient, strategic maneuvering that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. Effective control is quiet. It produces compliance without the target ever fully recognizing that compliance was being engineered. But the control attempts that emerge during deep suffering are none of these things. They are loud, they are transparent, they are disproportionate to the situations that trigger them, and they extend into areas of other people's lives and behaviors that the narcissist would previously have managed with far more restraint. The hidden reason behind this behavioral shift reveals the most important truth in the entire suffering pattern. These desperate, visible, poorly calibrated attempts to control the environment, the narrative, and the people within reach are not the behavior of someone operating from power. They are the behavior of someone who feels profoundly, terrifyingly powerless, and who has no internal resources left to conceal it. Pay attention to what this transparency reveals, because when the control stops being subtle, when it stops being strategic, when it becomes raw and visible and disproportionate, the mask that the entire personality structure was built to maintain has begun. Finally, to slip, and what is underneath it was never what it claimed to be. When you lay all 7 signals side by side, the escalating validation demands, the disproportionate rage, the obsessive comparisons, the strategic withdrawal, the accelerating devaluation, the behavioral deterioration, and the desperate phantom control attempts, something becomes visible that individual moments inside these dynamics almost never reveal. The suffering was always there, not as an excuse, not as a justification for the damage these patterns produce in the people who encounter them, but as a structural reality of a personality that was built somewhere early and somewhere deep around the absence of something fundamental, the capacity to exist stably and securely without continuous external confirmation of worth. What most people don't realize is that the narcissist's suffering and the narcissist's destructiveness are not separate phenomena. They are the same phenomenon, two faces of a single internal condition in which the inability to tolerate one's own inadequacy gets converted automatically and without conscious deliberation into behavior that makes others feel inadequate instead. The hidden reason behind every signal discussed in this video points to the same place, not power, not superiority, not the confident dominance the persona was always designed to project, but a profound and structural emptiness that the entire behavioral architecture was constructed to keep hidden from others, and most importantly, from themselves. Pay attention to this the next time these patterns appear in your experience. Because the person performing superiority most aggressively is rarely the person who feels it most genuinely. And the behavior that looks most like strength, the control, the rage, the relentless devaluation of everyone within reach, is almost always the clearest signal available that something underneath has been quietly falling apart for a very long time. The suffering was never hidden. It was always in the behavior. Most people just didn't know how to read it.